That's got to be quite a unique experience, I imagine.
Definitely, it was something that I didn't anticipate. I think early on in my career, as I was thinking about the steps that I would take and where I would end up, I was sort of thinking, well, maybe if I'm really, really good at technology and I work really hard, maybe one day I'll be like a chief technology officer or something like that. But certainly didn't see myself doing sales or finance or these different functions that you have to figure out if you're going to be CEO.
If you work in a tech business, or if you want to work in a tech business, and you've ever pondered how best to progress your career to reach that leadership level, maybe even the lofty heights of CEO, then this is an episode you don't want to miss. Hello, listeners, and welcome to the next episode in our series that we're doing for the month of December. We are talking about the intersection of technology and leadership. The AI won't do it for you. Leading in tech. And today's episode is pretty bang on that theme. I'm joined by Matt Warden. He is a tech CEO. He's also an executive coach. He's spent over 25 years in a tech company. And in fact, what's quite unique about his journey is that he's gone within the same company from initially joining as a developer and a data handler, and worked his way all the way up to CEO, again, in the same business, which is quite unusual. So we're going to hear a bit about his journey, a few stories, and some of the really crucial leadership lessons that he's learned over the years. Obviously, extremely relevant to tech leadership because he is a tech leader. So we'll be talking all of those things. We're going to get a bit into some of the technology aspects as well. So we'll have another conversation, as we inevitably always do when I have a techie on the podcast, about ChatGPT, about the future of AI, and about some of those technology trends over the years that may or may not have stuck with us. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I hope you are too. So without further ado, let's get Matt on the show.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Matt, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's great to have you here. Really looking forward to hearing some of your experiences and stories that you're going to share with us today.
Yeah, David, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, we're going to kick off really by handing over to you a little bit to tell the listeners a bit about your background, your career history, what you do today, and how you've ended up doing it.
Yeah, so I've been in technology since the tail end of the dot-com boom. I started as a software engineer working with technologies that don't really exist anymore, or they're done by frameworks and libraries and things like that for you. Then I was a consultant with one of the major consulting companies. The second half of my career has been at my current company, which is called DoubleLine. We are an education technology consulting company. We work with any kind of organization that provides education. So early childhood education, primary school, secondary school, post-secondary. And then we work with the layers of government above them. At that company, I started as a data modeler, just kind of building out data models and defining a data standard. Then I led the team that was, as a project manager, leading that team. Then I was asked by leadership to train other project managers on my approach. From there, I took on technology oversight company-wide, later added operational oversight. When our head of sales left, then I added sales company-wide. Definitely did not expect that I would be doing sales ever, but I really took some time to figure that out. And then the last 5 years, I've been with the company as the CEO. I've definitely benefited heavily from mentorship and learning some things the hard way. And then because of that on the side, I coach early executives on how to rapidly grow their career as I did, hopefully not making some of the mistakes that I did. And, ultimately I get a lot of reward out of seeing people I coach grow their own careers.
Quite a rare journey, I imagine, going within the same company, at least, from the sort of the data, the developer, right? I don't want to use pejorative terms, but at the bottom of the company, let's say, and then all the way through to leading the whole business. That's got to be quite a unique experience, I imagine.
Definitely, it was something that I didn't anticipate. I think early on in my career, as I was thinking about the steps that I would take and where I would end up, I was sort of thinking, well, maybe if I'm really, really good at technology and I work really hard, maybe one day I'll be like a chief technology officer or something like that. But certainly didn't see myself doing sales or finance or these different functions that you have to figure out if you're going to be CEO. So I do agree with you that the path is unique. I think the biggest thing that I did right is take opportunities as they came to me. So like I said, the example of the head of sales leaving the company and the CEO at the time kind of scrambling to figure out how we're going to keep the pipeline going and things like that. I had done a little bit of work helping, the proposal development process from a technology standpoint. So I had some insight into how that process worked. I was asked to just kind of keep it going for 3 months. And then you fast forward a number of years, I'm still doing it. Right. So I think just being willing to take those chances and being pretty uncomfortable with doing things I hadn't done before. But on the flip side, I also feel like I could have done it faster if I didn't have kind of built in my head about the things that I maybe am not good at. I had sort of a framework in my head about things that I would be good at and not good at. And I think that might have slowed me down too. So I agree with you that I've had the, fast rise in the organization. Part of that is the company culture, and part of it is my willingness to take on different opportunities as they come. But I've also, like I said, done some things learned some things the hard way, and ultimately that has helped me kind of get to where I am. But if I could do it all over again, I would have maybe not had that framework in my mind about what I could and couldn't do.
It's funny, isn't it, how often things in your head hold you back and you don't realize until much later. And I'm not sure how big the company is, but it sounds like it's probably a small to medium sized business, just based on the story you've told us so far. Because I think that's a feature, isn't it, of the smaller businesses compared to the big corporations, is you do end up almost by default or by luck rather than judgment or planning, getting involved in so many different aspects of the business, which in a lot of respects is what's so exciting about working for a company like that.
That is true. Yeah, I was employee number 7 when I joined, and we're about 90 now. Mm-hmm. So we've grown quite a bit on a percentage basis. But you're very right that, like, relative to larger organizations, we're still a small company. And yeah, I do think that the size of the company matters a lot. I also think that some of the ways that the company works matters too, because you could be a relatively small company, but perhaps the culture is very rigid in the job descriptions and things like that. But I ultimately benefited greatly by the flexibility and the ability to take on new tasks and help in areas that perhaps my job description at the time didn't say I was responsible for.
Yeah, I think you've got to have the right mindset for it, haven't you? I mean, it's not for everyone. Some people kind of need that very regimented job description, and they never stray outside those lines. And that's fine, fair enough. It's not for everyone. But also, if you can view it as what it is, which is, I think, an opportunity to learn, opportunity to test out new skills, see if you like different job functions, then it's an amazing opportunity, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there was one time in my progression where I was pretty confused, because I was hearing from some employees about how in the organization at DoubleLine, there weren't defined paths where they could progress. And hearing that as someone who started out as a data modeler and is now CEO is difficult to really understand. But I think what you're saying is true, that for some people, laying out that path, laying out that job ladder, if you will, is important for them, so they can kind of see that progression and understand what skills they need to develop as they go through those different steps. And other people may not need that, but those are two different personalities that the organization needs to be able to address both, right? So that was something that I learned through the process, because I didn't need that, and I kind of viewed it as, let me take the opportunities as they come, figure out what that means from a career standpoint. But that's not how everybody operates. And I think what you're saying is very true, that it's important for organizations to lay that out also give opportunities where they are to sort of get exposure to new skills and things like that. I know plenty of larger companies that try to mimic this by having the sort of management program where they rotate people into different functions and get them exposure to different parts of the organization. I think at a smaller company, you don't necessarily have to do that in that way, but you can see that the larger companies trying to do a similar thing as is sort of naturally available in many small companies.
Yeah, although I have to say in a smaller company, in a lot of respects, that's actually quite an important thing to do because there's that fewer people around. If one of them, I don't know, worst case, gets hit by a bus or something, if nobody else knows how to do that job, then you've got a sudden hole in the business and there's a bit of a problem. So yeah, I mean, maybe there's a question of balance perhaps and different approaches, and being flexible is the way forward, as with the progression routes as well.
That's very true. And then the other thing that makes it difficult and makes your point even more valid at a small company is that your processes are less mature, right? You've got maybe less documented and things like that, especially if you're growing rapidly. Even if you have things documented, the things that were documented 2 years ago may not be as relevant as in your current state. So I think that's an important point, that you have to think about succession planning and thinking about the risks within the organization from a people standpoint, and where are those key elements, those key points of failure that you should have a plan B and a plan C.
Absolutely. And so education technology then, tell us a bit more about that and what kind of projects you get involved in.
Yeah, education technology really has, I would say, two areas. One is compliance reporting. So, taxpayers fund public education. They want to know their investment's working. The current way that we do this is through a lot of compliance reporting. I think initially the idea was quite reasonable. If you rewind 20 years in the States, they might have asked for one file to be sent to the federal government once a year, that kind of thing. That seems pretty reasonable. But then another piece of legislation gets passed, and another, and another. And before you know it, primary schools, secondary schools, they're submitting 40 plus reports annually. Each has its own business rules and data definitions and timing. Many overlap with each other. So it has become quite a mess, and it's a big distraction from the job of education. So, we help modernize the data infrastructures and the process to rationalize reporting requirements so that it's the same data set that we're reporting each time, and it's done in a more automated and standards-based way. So just as an example, one study of the work that we did in Michigan, they're saving $60 million every single year just from the automation that we have put in place. So that's the size of the problem in most states. The second area of education technology is just classroom effectiveness. So I think teachers are asked to do a nearly impossible job. In most cases, they see more students in a day than they used to. There's lots of context switching. They're expected to know when one student needs extra supports, even though they see 150 students in a day. So I think technology improves education because tech gives teachers a fighting chance at meeting that challenge. If patterns in the data can be highlighted and potential supports for students suggested, I think a teacher can use his or her experience to select and execute and then monitor an approach to support each student. But the problem is that the systems don't talk to each other. So you have all these systems that make education better in some way. They don't talk to each other, and that fractionalizes the picture of a student, both their context and their learning progress. So what ends up happening in many school districts and many classrooms is you have what I call the human API. So you've got teachers kind of pulling down data from different systems into Excel or Google Sheets. They're manipulating that, trying to get the full picture of the student. That, of course, takes time. Some teachers feel like all they do is jockey data around in Excel. They have a passion for teaching. That's why they came into teaching, but they spend most of the time jockeying data in Excel. And then by the time they get it done, that data is already stale. So we work to stitch that fractionalized picture together in more real time and let teachers get back to teaching. So I think the benefits of technology in education are significant, but there are also these challenges, and we have to kind of do technology the right way.
Yeah, I mean, that 16 million figure, wow, that is a huge impact, isn't it? And I mean, if you equate that to kind of time spent by teachers and administrators doing paperwork, I suppose, isn't it? It's filling in forms and things like that. I mean, yeah, it kind of almost boggles the mind, doesn't it? That there's that much to do in the first place.
Well, it's an element of scale, right? In Michigan, they have over 900 different school districts, and each one of them is doing these, 40 plus reports. And so if you can improve that process by X percent, that gets multiplied across 900 different entities. So the scale that we're talking about here is just so significant. And I think the challenge is that each one of these mandated requirements doesn't seem burdensome in its own right, but I think in totality, it's quite burdensome, and it's just a distraction from what we're trying to do, which is teach kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And without getting into the politics of it, there's the other aspect of kind of the schooling system. I'm sure it's very similar in the States as it is here, where, teachers are underpaid, under-resourced, all of these other systemic problems, and then you're adding the extra admin on top. I mean, I can really see the value of what you're doing there, 100%.
Well, there's a big teacher shortage. I mean, the reality is, regardless of what are the factors, I mean, we have too few teachers. We have a lot of teachers leaving the profession, certainly since COVID. Things got a lot more complicated during COVID. The reality is that, at least prior to COVID, the progression that each student was going through in each grade was similar. They may have had different experiences, different things that they picked up on and didn't pick up on. But during COVID, when we moved to remote schooling, there's a little bit of a Swiss cheese effect where each student may have had effective learning at different times within the lesson plan. So one student, for example, may have not really been focused very early on, and then kind of got focused on the remote learning because their parents intervened or whatever. And then another student might have the opposite impact, where they initially were very focused. They had the momentum coming from their in-person instruction, and then they transitioned that to learning, but then they saw their friends playing outside, et cetera, and then they didn't focus as much later on. And so teachers now receiving students that went through sixth grade during COVID, they don't have the same baseline commonality across all of their students. So the need for more personalized instruction just got 3x, 4x. So it's not even just the number of students that they're engaging and the same challenge that they were experiencing pre-COVID, but it's gotten a lot more complicated and a lot more demanding. And I think a lot of teachers are burned out. So I think anything that we can do, I mean, we're just a technology and data company. So we don't teach kids directly, et cetera. But if we can make the job experience a little bit better for teachers, that's going to make a big difference in the districts that are affected by that. And I think it's needed. So I think everybody in the education technology industry needs to be working on that. And they are. I think everyone's in that space is very passionate about education, and we're doing what we can do, but it's a tough situation, like you were saying, not just for pay and other reasons, but it's a difficult job for sure.
Yeah, I wonder how many parallels there are to the wider kind of workplace as well, with the whole COVID and remote working of it all. And it feels like in a lot of ways, nothing really changed. It's just there's a very big change in terms of face-to-face and access, I suppose. And in a teaching environment, yeah, I can see how difficult that must be. Because I guess, kids probably haven't changed that much really in terms of differing attention spans and having to keep an eye on different kids at different times of a lesson and all those kind of things you're talking about. It's just that now you can't do it as easily because you can't, as a teacher, just glance up and see the whole room and the whole class at once. It's not the same for a camera, is it?
That is definitely right. And even like some very small things or seemingly small things like attendance became a lot more complicated, right? It used to be, is the child's rear end in the seat or not, right? And if yes, then that student is in attendance. If not, then they're not. But during the remote teaching scenario, it wasn't just, are they logged into the Zoom It's, do they have their cameras on? Are they paying attention? Do they upload something to the Google Drive for their homework? Do they log into learning management systems? So it was this combination of a lot of different factors. And again, it may not seem like a big thing, but now the teachers are responsible for reporting attendance. So they had to do all of that analysis, whereas before there was just a really quick look to see if the person was there or not.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of the funny videos that went around on social media during the period. More again from the workplace angle, like the artificial Zoom backgrounds, and when people figured out you could have a video Zoom background. And so there was that quite famous one of the guy who made a recording of himself bringing a cup of tea. And then he had that as his Zoom background, so like he was bringing himself a cup of tea in a meeting and that kind of thing. And it does make me wonder, like, how many kids are gaming the system by just like recording themselves in advance and then just having that as their Zoom background and walking away.
And you're exactly right. And again, it's sort of it was always the case that parental engagement mattered in education. It was always a factor, but it mattered differently during COVID. And again, now that with everyone back in the school in person, the teachers are trying to carry education forward, and they don't have a common baseline as students are coming in. So it just got a lot more complicated, a lot more personalized instructions required, and data can help there. And then you've got experienced teachers, hopefully experienced teachers, but you also have a lot of turnover. So again, a lot of new teachers too. So it's a complicated picture. And again, we can't solve all of that ourselves, but we're trying to solve our little corner of it and try to make the experience for teachers a little bit better.
Well, fair enough. Okay, so I'm going to change topic a little bit. I'm really interested to hear a bit more about your journey from developer, if you like, to CEO, particularly because it's happened in such a relatively short period of time. So let's start with where you are now. What are some of the most uncomfortable things about being the CEO? What do you really struggle with?
The most uncomfortable thing about being CEO is not having a boss. I never appreciated the comfort of having a manager until I no longer had one. Just the tactical, what should I do today, this week, this month, this quarter, this year, or even this 3 years? That's now I have to figure that out. I don't have the same guidance that I had when I was lower in the organization. Even what does success look like? Of course, I've got, revenue and EBITDA and things like that. But how I go about that and what are the interim measures of success as we are marching through the year. I have to define that. And, then the questions that are on my mind a lot about, is my strategy going to work? What should I be doing myself versus delegating? How many leadership team positions should I have? And what are those positions? Will my next layer down let me down? I think these are really tough questions. And I think, I understand a lot better what, the sort of the cliche of it's lonely at the top. I mean, it's very true that there are, of course, you've got a leadership team, you can get their inputs, etc. But at the end of the day, it's your call. And then the other thing is that all of this constantly changes as you're growing. So you might have figured it out, what I should be focused on for today, this week, this month, this quarter. But I can't necessarily take that into 2024 because we're going to be a different company then. So it's constantly changing and constantly evolving. It keeps it exciting. I really enjoy that part of it, but it's also extremely uncomfortable. I do think that you have to have a framework around strategy. You have to have a mentor or a coach. You've got to have some way to get your head around what you should be spending your time on, not just for effectiveness, but also for comfort.
Yeah, I was about to ask what have you done to help cope with some of those challenges, but I think you just answered it.
Well, I think I've gone through a couple iterations, but yeah, the way I'm approaching it now is, essentially I've got a framework for strategy, having a target 10 years out, painting a picture 3 years out, having a plan for the current year, and then breaking that plan down to quarterly objectives. So I think that allows me to figure out what that should look like. And how does that translate into what I ought to be doing? And then how can I delegate components of that down the layer beneath me? And how do I monitor that progress over time? What does success look like? All those things I just talked about. I think you have to have a framework. And there are lots of frameworks out there, lots of models out there. It's less important which one you pick, and it's more important that you pick one, I think. And then secondly, like I said, I think having some external mentor or coach or somebody you can bounce ideas off of that isn't influenced by the managerial relationship. Again, you want input from your leadership team, et cetera, but it's going to be filtered no matter how good of a relationship you have with them, et cetera. Like, they're still dependent on you for a paycheck and all this kind of thing. So there's going to be an element of that will be filtered. So get that input, but also have some external source for bouncing ideas off of.
I mean, I think that's good advice. Yeah, that kind of the manager, the boss relationship is a challenging one, isn't it? And I think the best way to explain it, or the simplest way to explain it, I think, is the workplace joke, isn't it? It's like, if you make a joke and everyone laughs, are they laughing because your joke was funny or because you're paying them?
Yeah.
And it's, that was something I always struggled with as well, actually. Not that I made that many jokes, and when I did, they probably weren't funny, but you know.
No, it's a difficult element because, you know, especially because each person in the leadership team beneath you has their function that they're responsible for. Of course, the leadership team as a whole is accountable for the success of the company, but the salesperson is primarily focused on sales. The ops person is primarily focused on ops. So they've got their perspective. They've also got a bit of a fraction of the information. Then, as the CEO, you're trying to integrate all of the information from all the different functions. And you're just necessarily going to have a different perspective as each person. So there are going to be things that they understand that you don't because they're more in the details, but there are also going to be things that you understand that they don't because you've got a cross-functional view of things. So that's definitely an element. And then, there is also just their own progression and helping them get to a stronger place in their own careers. And some people continue to progress and some people do not. So those are tough conversations and decisions as well. All those types of things where I think the hardest decisions are the people decisions. Like I said, how many leadership team positions and what are they and who are they? Like, those are difficult decisions, and it adds a whole different layer of complexity in addition to just, trying to figure out what the right strategy is.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot more pressure there, isn't there, for so many reasons. I mean, you don't want to make someone unhappy. You don't want to put them in the wrong job. And also the people stuff is so difficult, isn't it? I think that's why everyone struggles with it, to be honest.
Absolutely. And everybody has, each employee that you have, each leadership team member that you have, they have their own career progression in mind. They have a goal that they want to achieve. And if the company that they're at, your company, is a place where they can achieve that goal, that's great. And that makes it easy. The hard part is when that's maybe not the case. If they've got a goal that you're pretty sure isn't going to be achievable at your company, then what do you do, right? That goes back to your point earlier about thinking about, plan B, plan C. You can't have a single point of failure in the organization, especially if there's sort of a divergent path at some point in the future. So plan A certainly is to figure out how can you support that person and help them achieve their goals within the organization. But like, we're a services company, for example. So if someone was really interested in learning about product, I really can't help them. That's not what we do. So trying to figure that out and being okay with perhaps at some point us being a stepping stone in that person's career versus the end state.
Yes, I love that last comment, actually. I think that's somewhere that a lot of leaders go wrong, is in not taking that longer term, more mature view of people leaving your business, because really the right way to look at it is it's inevitable. No one's going to stay at the same company forever. Sooner or later, and these days it's probably sooner because turnover is a lot higher than it used to be even 5-10 years ago. But sooner or later, people are going to leave the business. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. It doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to be acrimonious. But I think a lot of leaders make the mistake of thinking it is and it should be. And so it becomes self-fulfilling at that stage then, doesn't it? Because you just make someone feel horrible for leaving, and so they leave under a cloud and they'll never come back in their future career. And so you've lost that long-term potential.
You're right. And we've had a number of boomerangs, people who have left and come back later. And I think part of what I put in place to try to avoid the mindset that you're talking about we actually do a couple of things when someone leaves. I will write a postcard to them and mail it to them, sort of thanking them for their contributions and wishing them well in their next steps, etc. And that's a small thing. It takes me 5 minutes to do, but everybody, my HR person, my leadership team knows that I do that. And I think it's an important signal about what is our culture around people leaving. And is it something that we are, angry about, sad about, et cetera? We can be sad about it, but it's also, we should be happy that they were able to grow during their time at DoubleLine, and they were able to then achieve this next step in their career, and maybe they'll come back, right? I think that's happened a number of times. We've had people come back later, and, I think navigating your career is difficult. Like, there have been times in my own career where I wanted to move on somewhere else, and I did move on. And sometimes that's the right move. Sometimes you think back, oh man, that was actually there are certain things about that job that I maybe took for granted or didn't expect. So the grass is not always greener where you're going. And I think that, for some percentage of people that are leaving DoubleLine, that's going to be the case. So I want them to be leaving, not with a cloud over their head, but with a very positive experience, and with a little bit of, maybe back in their mind, they're a little bit of regret perhaps, and they think about it later on in their career, and perhaps they come back.
Exactly. And actually, I know you think, or you say that's a small thing, but actually I think that's quite big. I don't think there's many CEOs out there who are going to take the time to write a personal note to everyone who leaves the business. And it is a lovely gesture, and it creates exactly that right kind of mindset, that right perception in the mind of the person who's leaving as well. I think that's a really powerful practice. And so, yeah, really good. Well done.
Yeah. I think, sometimes maybe we send it to them and they throw it away. They say that's great, throw it away. But I think sometimes they will think it's kind of cool, and they'll keep it around, and maybe that's a reminder for them later on in their career. So I think it's maybe good for them, but it's also selfish. I mean, I want them to have a positive feeling about DoubleLine and maybe come back.
Yeah. True enough. What's your opinion on, once someone's decided to leave, should you try and persuade them to stay, if assuming you want to keep them?
I have strong feelings about this, and I don't ever try to keep them around, because I think that money is sometimes the issue, but it's generally not the issue. And of course, I would like to understand through a next interview or maybe a direct conversation what was leading them to that point. But we are a smaller organization, and you said before about not every CEO would write a personal note. Well, I can, because we're only 90 people, but we're a smaller organization, so I also generally am not completely surprised, right? Or at least I can understand their reason, and I can see how that would be something that you want to do, and we can't really deliver for you here at DoubleLine. So I think trying to understand where they're coming from so that we can maybe improve our internal processes if it's something we can improve. But I am generally I'm almost never on board with trying to persuade someone to stick around once they've made a decision. I think they're just mentally already there, and unless they are using that to try to negotiate, they're probably already half checked out. And I think it's important to let them continue and make sure that they understand the door's open.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you said that, because that's exactly my position as well. I think partly for me it's because the reasons you say, they're already probably checked out. And so do you really want someone who's kind of got one foot out the door already staying? And do you want to jump through enough hoops to make them stay? And then really it's probably a short-term solution anyway, unless you're somehow able to solve the reason they're leaving in the first place. And that's not always about the money, is it? And so if it is the money, that's relatively easy, assuming you have budget and all these other things. If it's not, that could be potentially quite difficult to solve, and you probably won't know about it anyway. And so it feels like trying to persuade them to stay, best case, all you're going to do is just kick the problem down the road a little bit, and it's still going to be there in a few months' time or a year's time.
The other thing is, I do think there's an element, thinking about it from the CEO's perspective, of company culture. So you get more of the behavior that you reward. And I do think that there is a consideration around if it is an effective tactic to leverage an offer elsewhere to renegotiate your salary, you're going to get more of that. So maybe that's okay for you as a leader, but one of the other big things that I am big about is focus. And I want to be focused on driving the business forward. I don't want to be mired in a lot of conversations about this sort of thing. So I want to make sure I have a HR infrastructure that is keeping people happy and at market, but I don't want to be spending a lot of time on these one-off conversations. So I think there's an opportunity cost too. And it's not just about that one conversation. It's about precedent, and it's about the company culture and what works and doesn't work. So I think at some level, the people in the company know that I have this viewpoint. And if they're at a point where they are ready to leave, then they leave. And if they're short of that, then they would take other avenues, sort of perhaps communicating certain things that they're unhappy with or would like us to improve or whatever, versus trying to use the tactic around an external offer.
Yeah, 100%. I think you're right there as well. And it's, at the end of the day, if someone comes to you and says, I've got a job offer for more money, better perks, I'm going to go and do that. I mean, my first reaction to that is, that's amazing. I'm really happy for you. What can I do to help make it an easier transition for you? And hope you come back one day, but best of luck. And if your immediate reaction is, oh, what can I do to make you stay? How much will it take? I think, yeah, you're right. It's just not worth it in the long run, is it?
I think it also comes down to the company's core values and what is the value proposition for an employee. Ultimately, if it's purely financial, which I think for some companies that might be the element, but we're a mission-driven company. We're focused on education, and we try to attract people who are also they enjoy that mission. They want to be a part of that mission. So we still have to make sure that we're, of course, taking care of our employees from a comp standpoint. But, some of the element is that's not the only deciding factor about someone's time at a company like us. So that's an element that we focus on, because the reality is, especially in Austin, Texas, where we're located, there's a lot of tech activity, and there are hundreds, thousands of tech companies, and someone's going to pay you $5,000 more a year. So if that's the only thing keeping people where they are, then, you're probably going to lose that battle, especially a company like ours. It's not public. We can't hand out, stock options and things like that. So there are just different factors, and you have to think about what is your employee value proposition and how you differentiate yourself relative to other companies in the same geographical area that you're pulling from.
Indeed. Well, we went off on a bit of a tangent there, but I'm okay with it because it was quite interesting. Bringing us back to where we started that conversation. So the challenges with being the CEO, how does that kind of discomfort that you experience, how does that compare to perhaps the similar discomfort that you might remember from way back when you were first a manager? Way back, it wasn't that long ago.
The first time I was a manager, I think the discomfort was more around delegation. I think I had a tough time delegating. I had a tough time with the idea of being accountable for the outcome when I'm not the one doing the work. I feel like, at least for me, it's more comfortable that if I'm the one doing the work, okay, I understand I'm accountable for what that looks like. I have my own personal standard for quality and completeness. I've actually, I've been elevated into a manager role in part because of that standard. So, having that bar, and yet in some ways maybe having to be comfortable with lowering that standard a little bit in order to delegate that to folks, especially because part of that management process is sometimes letting people stumble a little bit so they can grow themselves. So that, I think, was the initial challenge I had around being a manager, is just figuring out how to get things done through others and being comfortable with it perhaps not being done the way I would have done it.
I think this is a common theme, actually, with a lot of people when I ask them similar questions, or we have that conversation about what did you struggle with when you first became a manager. And I think it's quite closely linked to this problem of micromanagement as well. I think people experience the problems you've described, and then that leads them sometimes into just being excessively managey, just like the overbearing supervision kind of approach. It is definitely something people struggle with a lot in that kind of that transitional period of having been used to only being accountable for their own work. and then suddenly not just being accountable for theirs, but also others. And then on top of that, as you say, not wanting to get stuck in the middle of doing someone else's work for them. Because at the end of the day, if you do that, you might as well just not be the manager and just go back and do your old job. You're not really bringing any value to the situation if you're doing that.
That is true. I do think that's one way that is very common, how people will react to that situation. I didn't have the reaction to be more micromanagement oriented, but I did have the reaction of being critical of the outputs and trying to, I mean, it was well intentioned. I was trying to help people grow, but there's also an element of there's only so much criticism that someone can take, right? So I think trying to balance that out about, being patient with the progression, so long as there is a continuous improvement, that should be what we're looking for, not necessarily, you're able to get something done at 80% one day and then we have a conversation and now you're at 100%. I think that was my challenge, is trying to make sure that I'm not being overly critical, that I'm providing guidance and support, but not so much so that I'm, affecting the employee's experience at the company and things like that. So, I think that was my big challenge, because, ultimately I viewed it as, hey, I'm trying to help this person learn and get to a better place. But, it's about finding ways and tactics to deliver that and support that, and being patient with that progress, and not expecting them to get to 100% right off the bat.
Yes. Again, a lot of conversations I have with other coaches and leadership experts, there's two kind of themes that come out on this point. One is most people don't learn as well by somebody telling them how to do something than by trying it and getting it wrong a few times themselves. So I think that's very important. And then the other point you made earlier about just because they do it in a different way to the way I would have done it doesn't mean their way is wrong. The output, the outcome, the standard has still been met. It's just taking a different route to get there, and that's fine. And that, again, is part of that adjustment, isn't it? And it can be very difficult for new managers, certainly.
I think as you're growing as a manager, you start to think about more medium-term and longer-term objectives, and you get less concerned about the particular task and how the task is getting done. So you just made a great point about, supporting people as they perhaps sometimes fail, right? And that is a necessary component to learning for some people, right? Is to try this thing out, see how it works. Maybe it didn't quite work out the right way. And one of the elements that I had to mature on was, having a conversation with someone I'm managing, hearing their approach, knowing that's probably not going to work, but then making a decision during that conversation about whether or not to redirect them or to, give them some pointers perhaps and some hints, but let them figure out whether or not that's going to work themselves. And that's, as someone who, again, has a high bar for quality and completeness, that was a challenge for me, is kind of stepping back and saying, all right, we're going to let this play out a little bit, because in my head, I'm thinking, hey, if we're delayed by 2 weeks, 3 weeks or whatever, that's less impactful than the impact I can have by having this person learn this lesson and get to a better place as an employee on my team. So that's something that, I think as you're getting more experience as a manager, you start to think more medium term, more long term, and get less concerned with a specific task.
Yes, I think that was probably my own experience as well. Yeah, I mean, my first time as manager, it was less technical, but certainly I was quite similar to you, I think, in terms of when I was the one doing the work, it was all about the attention to detail. And so, yeah, I really struggled with that myself as well, because not everyone had the same level of attention to detail as I did. And so I found myself sort of picking on very small things. And once I realized I was doing it, it was actually relatively easy to stop. But if I hadn't realized, God, I might still be there today. Let's talk a bit more about tech then, because it is really interesting to me, given the kind of the career history you've got and having been in the tech focused industry for so long. What would you say are some of the more memorable trends and myths and some of the kind of the silly tech prediction that you've seen over the years?
I don't want to call it silly, but I do think that for certain industries, when it came to the push around blockchain, taking the Bitcoin model and applying it to a lot of different contexts, I think for certain industries, that was a technology that was looking for a use case. That was definitely the case in education technology. There were a number of cases around teacher credentialing, for example, where there is an authoritative central, body that determines this certification. And yet we were trying to figure out how can we apply blockchain to this. And there were just very minimal benefits and a lot of extra costs. So there were a lot of things like that where I remember for 2-3 years, there were lots of discussions about how to apply blockchain to different problem statements. So that I think is something we have to look out for, is when there's some new technology, is that something that we're just excited about and we're trying to find a reason to use it? Or is there something that truly would get solved by this? And I've heard some conversation more recently about, the large language models, the LLMs, and does that fit in that same category? I don't think it does. Having gone through the blockchain experience and sort of being throughout that on the side of, hey, I don't think this is really necessary. I see it different when it comes to the LLMs, because there are some interesting use cases. And I think most importantly, those use cases are accessible. So there have always been a lot of really interesting AI use cases in education and in other situations, of course, other industries. But the problem has generally been that the technology is inaccessible. So it's hard for me as a technologist to pitch to one of my clients that we should implement a predictive model or a neural network, right? Because those are things that they haven't played with before themselves, and they're not really entirely sure what that is. And there's always some fear around it about how does this impact my staff, and do I have to get rid of people and all that kind of stuff, right? There's all kinds of fears that come up when there's a technology that people don't understand. But the LLMs, because anyone can open up a browser and play around with it, that has really opened the door to people being comfortable with at least LLMs. And then that has tended to open up the door to having conversations about these use cases in AI that have been around, and the ideas have been there for a long time, but there just hasn't been an openness to it. So that, I think, is fundamentally different than some of the past trends like blockchain, because of the accessibility and because people are familiar with these models. In fact, if anything, we have kind of the opposite problem, where I'm seeing a lot of people who are familiar with LLMs over apply it to a lot of cases because they are familiar with it. They do think, hey, can I use an LLM for this? And that's not really what an LLM is for. But overall, it's a very positive thing. Whereas, some of the past trends have I wouldn't say silly, but they're just, they just kind of were technologies looking for a use case in many cases.
I like that phrase, technology looking for a use case. That is good. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of a few things less on the software side that I've seen in aerospace as well, and even in the space industry to a certain extent. There is quite a lot of that, I think, where someone's had a cool idea for some technology and they get kind of lost in that cool idea. And then almost too late, they come up for air and start looking for how is this actually going to be applied in the real world. It is interesting on the language models as well. And obviously ChatGPT is in the news all the time, isn't it? Of late. So do you think there's any danger of AI replacing teachers in schools in our lifetimes, or is that a bit too far-fetched?
I don't think that's near term. I mean, I'm not smart enough to be able to predict. The technology changes so quickly. It's hard for me to predict way down the road. But if I can use an analogy about our own company and how we have and haven't used LLMs. So certainly LLMs are available within programming tools, and we do a lot of software engineering. And I encourage our senior engineers to use those tools because I know that's going to make them more productive. They've got tons of experience. They can tell when the LLM has produced something that is not the right answer or whatever. At the same time, I discourage my junior engineers from using them because they don't have the experience to oversee what that LLM is doing. I heard an analogy, I forget where I heard this, but the analogy was essentially that the LLM is an intern. It can produce a lot of output pretty inexpensively, but you have to have the supervision of experience to understand when it's the right answer, when it's the wrong answer. And so to answer your question, I think that there is a lot of opportunity for LLMs to support teachers, help them develop content, like, for example, a weekly assessment for the content that we've covered that week. That's something that teachers or perhaps someone at the school district spend a lot of time developing. That really is a problem that could be generated pretty easily with an LLM, but it needs to be, but assessments are a unique sort of scientific thing. You have to be careful about how it's constructed and how the questions are asked and all this sort of thing. So you have to have someone that's overseeing that. And perhaps the LLM learns over time and does a better job, but we cannot remove or at least right now, we cannot remove the human from the loop. And I don't know if we ever will be able to do that.
Yeah. I guess it's more about whether we should rather than whether we could. I'm going to assume that at some point we could. But should is definitely a different question, to which the answer has to be no, in my opinion. But
I think that's an interesting question too. I do think that, unfortunately, like if the answer is we could, I think the answer then is that we would eventually remove them from the loop, regardless of the moral discussion there, just because I think that's sort of the gravity that would eventually pull itself in that direction. So I am, I guess, somewhat hopeful, but also I think possibly clear-minded that may not be the case. We may not be able to get to that point. So to the extent that the human is providing value in the loop, then the human will continue to be in the loop. And I think that, at least from as far as I can see in the horizon on this technology, which again, all the same caveats about how quickly it's changing, I feel pretty confident that at least in the medium term that we're going to need to have the human in the loop.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess in the short term, the biggest challenge with ChatGPT is kids using it to cheat on their homework. How do you check for that? Can you check for that? I don't know. It's another moral question, I suppose.
So I don't want to sit on the fence, but I am sympathetic to both sides of this argument. This is certainly an argument in the edtech space for sure. And one side says, listen, this is the same argument that came up when we had calculators in the classroom. This is the same argument that came up when we had laptops in the classroom. So I'm sympathetic to that viewpoint, and I think that's worth thinking about. I also understand where you're coming from, and I think that's a very, very valid point that, does it actually get in the way of learning? So I think the question is not, are they going to use ChatGPT or similar tools in their schooling? I think that's inevitable, whether you want it to be or not. And the one side is kind of in an arms race of developing tools to detect when ChatGPT is being used in homework and essays and things like that, and trying to, punish that behavior. And the other side is sort of saying, listen, this is inevitable. And if it's something that's so fundamental to our society going forward, similar to the web, similar to the computer, then these students need to learn how to use that in their day-to-day working. So I'm not sure what the right answer is there. I think both of them are pretty compelling arguments and viewpoints. If it is so fundamental to how we're going to be doing work in the future, if everyone's going to be involving LLMs in their daily work in the future, then I would probably lean more towards the latter argument that, I know I think about some of the older generation now in the use of computers and the web. They kind of view them as two different things. They have their job that they do, and then separately they can use this technology. Whereas younger generations, because we've grown up with cell phones, laptops, internet, etc., we don't see them as separate. We've integrated those two things together, and we could not do our jobs without those things. So it's an interesting question, and it requires a crystal ball that I don't have, but I think it's important to explore both of those paths as we move forward and not assume one or the other, and until we get more information.
I do see both sides of the argument as well, I have to admit. I think where it's different for me is in the fact that it's generative. So it's not the same as a calculator where you have a very simple question. There's an absolute right answer and there's loads of wrong answers, obviously. And you just, it's an immediate thing. With this one, you can ask more open-ended questions, and it could potentially write an essay for you. However, I do agree in a lot of ways it's no different to kids paying each other to write essays because they can't be bothered to do the homework. So, I feel like if someone's going to game the system, they're always going to find a way to do that. it kind of doesn't matter the how they do it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question about like, what are you really trying to measure? So did they come up with the right answer or not? Is one way to look at it. And did they go about coming out with the right answer in the way that you wanted them to is a different question. So if LLMs are going to always be there, then what does it really matter if they went about it in the way that used an LLM and it came up with the right answer? But I think the point I'm trying to make there is that it requires skill to use an LLM and produce the right answer. I'm not sure if you saw this story, but there was a lawyer that submitted a brief and used an LLM, and the LLM produced case sightings that didn't exist. So he cited those cases in his brief, and he got caught for it because the other side's like, these cases don't exist, and he got fined and sanctioned and all this kind of stuff. So that person didn't understand the technology and didn't understand how to use it responsibly and effectively in their job. If someone else had the ability to use that tool, understand how it worked, understand how to validate the output, etc., and could produce a brief with the assistance of an LLM, I don't know if that's something that we should be punishing. So I think it's an interesting point. And while I do acknowledge what you're saying about how it's different than a calculator and that sort of things, it's not generative. The reason that they were so bothered by that calculator was that they were trying to teach kids how to do arithmetic. And if the calculator can do the arithmetic for them, then they're not going to learn that. So it's less about, who's doing the work necessarily, and more about, is it going to obstruct the learning that we're trying to make happen? And all I'm saying is that we should be open to questioning what the learning is that we're trying to make happen. Because if we try to use the model from, the 1990s and say, well, these are the things that they need to be learning, then we're going to produce people that have the skills from the 1990s. So I think we have to be aware of how that's potentially going to change. And if we're all talking in a way that's like, hey, this is going to be so disruptive to our way of doing things that, we have to be we're so conscious of it that there might be like fears about, the humans not having jobs and things like that. If it's that disruptive, then it's something that we should be thinking about from an education standpoint. How do we make sure that the people that are going through the education system now have the tools and skills where they can use those capabilities?
Yeah, I agree. I do. I think in a lot of ways it kind of parallels, or is a different take on the whole argument about AI or whatever other technology back through history stealing people's jobs, in inverted commas.
Right.
Ultimately it's not the technology or whatever it is, whether it was like the robots in the factories or, the production line way back in the 1900s or today with AI, it's not going to actually replace you or take your job itself, but someone who knows how to use it might. And so I think that speaks very much to what you're saying. It's about preparing people for what the workplace will be like by the time they finish their education. And again, in a lot of ways, it's very similar to the calculator. I remember the teacher saying, you won't always have the calculator. You won't always be able to use that. That's why you need to know how this stuff works on your own. Well, turns out I've never been more than an arm's length away from a calculator since I left school. There's been one in my pocket, there's one on my wrist. So that was a completely empty argument.
That's exactly right. It's a great analogy, and that's exactly what I'm pointing out. Again, I'm not predicting that's going to be the output. I'm just saying I think we need to be conscious of those trends, and that the world's not going to be the same by the time those kids that are currently in school get into the workforce.
Yeah. I'm biased, of course, because I hated maths and it was my least favorite subject. So I was bound to go that way, but there we go. Let's talk a bit more about leadership. I know we've covered it a bit earlier, but I'd like to get into some more specifics. So the first question I have for you on that is, what would you say is the most important leadership lesson that you've learned in your career so far?
I think that, so the most important leadership lesson I've learned so far is that some percentage of people will always misunderstand your intentions, and that you shouldn't try to make this 0%. I think this is true with clients. It's true with employees. I think it's important to have high integrity, high transparency, communicate things clearly and often, have an open door policy. But everybody is coming to those communications and coming to the things that you're sharing and the direction you're taking the company with past experiences that set a lens for, how they're going to interpret all those things. And if we try to get it to 100 or to 0% of people misunderstanding intentions, it's just going to be a distraction. I think you have to develop an ability to be okay a little bit with misjudgment. Of course, always try to do as best job as possible. But early on, I had a big focus on, it's very uncomfortable to have people think you're doing X when you're really doing Y. So, but when you're leading a company of 90 people, or certainly much larger organizations, it's just going to be a reality that some percentage of people are going to misunderstand your intentions. And there are too many things to do running a company to get hung up on trying to make that 0%.
It's an uncomfortable truth, but I suspect you're right. Yeah. I think, at a certain point, it's like there's no point stressing or worrying about something you don't really have any control over. And I think all you can do, as you say, is communicate clearly, communicate consistently, often. And maybe I would add to that, always be willing to answer the questions.
Absolutely. And I give you another example of just outside of the employee context. A lot of our clients are nonprofit entities, and we are a for-profit entity. And as soon as I got into a role that involved sales, I noticed like a real change in how people, certain clients, especially our nonprofit clients, were viewing some advice that I was giving personally. I've always had, high integrity. I've always had this view that I will just tell you what I think is the right answer, and I'll let the chips fall as they may, even if in the short term that affects negatively my business. I firmly believe that consulting is about integrity. So if I tell you right now that you should do X, and that's actually going to end up canceling my project with you, well, that's terrible for me in the short term. But I think it's important to still do that so that we have a long-term relationship. So that's always been my viewpoint. But as soon as I got involved in sales, certain folks who have always been sort of in the nonprofit space had a skepticism about the advice all of a sudden. So I'm still the same person, but I think there was they've got a past experiences that are the lens through which they're viewing my advice now. And there's not, I was really bothered by that, and I could spend a lot of time, trying to grab a beer with them, trying to talk them through like how I think about things and try to change their viewpoint. But I think that's just a difficult thing to do. And I think it's, ultimately possibly a losing battle. You have to go back to what do you focus on as a leader in the company to really move the company forward. And I shouldn't focus on my personal sort of emotional reactions to how people are viewing things. If I feel comfortable with the integrity that I have and how I'm marching forward, that should, ultimately I have to be comfortable with that being as far as I get.
Yeah, there's parallels to loads of things, aren't there? A couple that pop into my mind. The sales one is interesting as well. It's almost like the sunk cost fallacy, isn't it? So if you're at the point where someone's not taking your advice in a sales context, or they're not buying, how much further effort should you expend on that, trying to persuade them, versus just moving on to the next person who might have a completely different point of view and might be a much easier exercise?
Yes, absolutely.
And then the other one that's weirdly is dating. The advice, well, never be yourself. Don't give out anything away there. But actually it's the opposite in reality. Be yourself. Because, if everything goes swimmingly well and you're then ending up spending the rest of your life with someone, you just got to keep up the lie for that much longer.
Right. That's interesting. Like I've never really thought about the connection to dating, but I can see the connection. It's been a long time since I've been doing that, but yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Yeah. You do kind of want to advertise, like going back to the employee value proposition, right? You kind of want to advertise what your company is about to have people self-select to join, right? Because that's going to lead to a longer tenure and people rowing in the same direction, et cetera. So I can see how that could relate somewhat to being yourself in a dating context, because you want people to self-select that are going to be compatible with you, not self-select or not selecting based on an image you're portraying that's not yourself.
Exactly. You've explained it much better than I did. Thank you. Okay, so opposite question. What would you say is the biggest mistake that most leaders will make?
I think that leaders underestimate three different things. One is they underestimate the importance of core values at a company. And I am a total convert. I am definitely someone who was not a big believer in core values earlier in my career. I thought core values were words that leadership teams liked the sound of and just kind of printed in an HR manual and put on a shelf, to gather dust. But why did I think that? Because that's how most leaders treat them. And I think of it this way. Pick 2 to 3 employees who, if you could just clone them 50 times, would unlock the growth of your company. Usually a leader can pick those 2 to 3 people. So why did you pick them? Those are your core values. And you could do the same exercise with your leadership team. You can have them pick, 2 to 3 employees. I bet you get similar answers. So what the core values are is a people filter. These are the qualities that you want. This is how you actually clone those 2 to 3 employees 50 times, is you set forth those core values. You hire based on them. You let people go based on them. You promote people based on them. So those, I think most leaders underestimate the value of core values. The second thing that they underestimate is the value of focus. So from a company, it's what I would call core focus. Who is your company and who is it not? This is your opportunity filter. Like, we have the skills, for example, at DoubleLine to build a manufacturing data warehouse. It's the same skills that are required for the data warehouse we build in education. But we're not going to go after the manufacturing data warehouse project, even though we've got the skill set to do so, because that's not who we are. And there, especially as you're growing and you have opportunities come your way, you're going to have to filter that accordingly. And one of the key decisions that leaders have to make as they're growing, especially early on, is what things you're going to say no to. And that's hard to do sometimes when you've got the realities of profit targets, revenue targets, cash, et cetera. But this is a really key thing. One of the things that I personally had to get exposure to was just filtering my own, what I personally focus on as a leader, especially as I was growing from an individual contributor into a manager, into a leadership team member, and now CEO. One of the books that was very influential, there's lots of books like this, but The One Thing by Gary Keller just very much helped me understand that it's not the number of things you get done, it's which things you get done. And the implication of that is that there are lots of important things that shouldn't be done. So I think a lot of leaders underestimate the value of focusing. The last thing is leaders underestimate the opportunity for internal disconnect. So what good are core values and core focus if the team is not on the same page? So you have to put effort into making sure that the company is bought into those core values, that they have credibility, that you yourself as a leader act on those in the way that's visible and that is credible, and that you are true to your core focus as well. To the extent that you deviate from that and you make sacrifices and compromises, the company is going to see that, and that's going to cause internal disconnect. I think from a comms standpoint, you have to say the same thing 7 times before they hear you. So it might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's about repeating. And when you're executing, especially a long-term plan, and you're giving updates as you go throughout that multi-year process, you have to recap the why. Why are we doing this to begin with? And what's the progress that we had made previous, and where are we currently as you give additional updates? So it should feel a little awkward because you as the leader, of course, are aware of the why and you are aware of the progress, but the people that are doing other functions in the company, they're not thinking about this every day. So it should feel a little awkward. It should feel a little repetitive, but just don't underestimate the opportunity for that disconnect internally. So the last thing I'll say on that is, one of the other difficult things is realizing that some people in the organization are going to be wrong in their belief that you're wrong. So I actually find it easier when I am wrong and someone says, "Hey, this is how I see it." I'm like, "That's a really good point," because that's really easy. I just need to change my own thinking, right? But if part of the company or someone in the company believes I'm wrong on a strategy, but I know that I'm not wrong, that's harder. Because now I have to figure out how can I, that's a disconnect element. And I have to figure out how do I get them rowing in the same direction. And that's a lot harder than just changing my own approach on something.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Definitely. I actually think you have quite an unusual point of view on that. I think there's a lot of CEOs out there, a lot of leaders who wouldn't want to admit when they're wrong, which is wrong. Yeah. But yeah, I really love what you were saying about values as well. I also am a convert on that. I think with my journey, it was a little bit different. It was more a case of none of the companies I worked for had value statements. And so I took the view of, well, if we don't have it, we've never needed it. So what's the point? But yeah, very much converted there, 100%. Because now I've seen subsequently the impact it can have, particularly when it's more than just that paper statement or the poster or something on a whiteboard in a management meeting once, but something that's actually kind of living, breathing, evolving, is being lived by the leadership as well. And so they're leading by example in that respect. To agree with all the things you said there. Love that. If you could start your career over again, is there anything you would do differently?
I sort of alluded to this earlier, but I think the number one thing I would do differently is forget what I think I won't be able to do. So as I was coming into different levels of my career, I didn't think I'd be good at sales. I'm not like I'm not an extrovert. So it takes a lot of energy for me to do some of the things you need to do in sales. So I didn't think I'd be good at that. I didn't think I'd be good at finance. I didn't take any finance classes when I was in college or anything like that. So those were things that I chose to hold myself back at certain points in my career. In fact, I could have been CEO earlier, but I said no. And I said no because I just didn't feel like I understood enough about KPIs and reading financial statements and things like that. And it's true that I didn't know how to do those things, but it wasn't true that I couldn't do those things. And ultimately, I didn't listen enough to people external, mentors and coaches, about what things would be easier than I thought. So again, I think it's important to have those other people in your life that can help check you a little bit. And I also wish that I didn't get in my own head so much about what I think my skills are and aren't.
It is one of the biggest problems of human nature, isn't it? Sometimes is assuming you'll be no good at something before you've even tried it. I think everyone can identify with that.
Absolutely. And there are certainly things that I'm not good at, but it's one thing to have experimented with that and not been successful versus just kind of having, if I'm honest, a little bit of a fear of doing this thing because I don't think I'll be good at it. And what's the point of doing it if I won't be good at it? So I think that mentality is not healthy and would really encourage my younger self to get exposure somehow to some of these things and confirm or deny whether I will be good at that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's assumption versus knowledge, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Really like that.
Leadership Heroes.
Okay. Last question. It's my favorite question, this one. It's called Leadership Heroes. And so if you had to pick one person, and they could be anyone you like, so alive or dead, past or present, real or fictitious, if you're feeling a bit crazy, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership, who would that person be and why?
So I think I'm supposed to think about someone that's sort of a public figure, but if you'll bear with me, I have a little bit of a weird answer, I think. My second grade teacher, even though, yes, she is leading children, that's not really the point. When I was going into second grade, my first grade teacher told my second grade teacher that I was a handful, I was a distraction in class, etc. Thankfully for me, my second grade teacher had skepticism and critical independent thinking, which I think are key leadership qualities. She realized that I was a distraction because I was bored, and she found extra ways to challenge me, which was not, she could just focus on the base, the base lessons, but she found ways to give me extra things to challenge me. So she took on extra work to go above and beyond, and she solved a problem not just for me, but for the class, because I was no longer a distraction. So, and the reason that I think that this is valid is that it's 32 years later, and I still remember this impact on my life. So it probably was very small to her. She probably doesn't remember it at all. It's probably something that she just approaches her job that way. But it, in hindsight, taught me a lot about, how you think about the information you receive. And, of course, you want more information than less information, but being skeptical of the information, having independent sort of critical thinking, and trying to solve problems with that as an input, but not with that as the only input. So I think good teachers or good leaders teach and also have a permanent impact on the people that they lead. So, like I said, it might sound a little weird, but someone that was really impactful in my life and taught me a lot was my second grade teacher.
I think it makes perfect sense. Yeah. If you think about it, in a lot of ways, teachers are the first leaders we're exposed to in life. And how fitting it is as well, given the career that you've had and what you do today, that you've picked a teacher. Does that maybe tell us a bit about your inspiration for what you do? Or
well, there's no question that my job doesn't feel like a job, in part because I do feel like I'm on a mission. Again, I want to be humble. I'm only doing a very small part of this overall picture, but I do firmly believe that if there were 5,000 companies like ours all trying to work on 1/5,000th of the problem, then we would make an amazing difference. So I'm trying to do my part. I feel very motivated by that, and there's no doubt that my experience with certain teachers and seeing how they put all themselves into something and really taught me a lot about not just the addition, subtraction, grammar, etc., but how do you actually go through life and make decisions and things like that. There's no question that in a classroom environment there is a authoritative figure, which is a teacher, and you're learning a lot from them, and you're forming yourself as a person, not just through the things you're learning, but your interactions with your peers and your interactions with an authority figure, all this kind of thing. So absolutely, that's a really formative thing to kids' lives, and it was a very formative thing for me.
I think you might be surprised as well about how much that teacher remembers. I've been surprised a few times over the years by, at least with the good teachers, the great teachers, they remember things. They remember you. They remember what you were like. They remember your parents' names, all sorts of weird things that you maybe wouldn't expect them to, but it's quite interesting on that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Matt, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Last thing I'll ask you is if any of the listeners would like to learn more about you, what you do, maybe if they're looking for some coaching or something where you might be able to help them out, would you like to point them towards your website or similar?
Of course. Yeah. It's just my name, mattwarden.com. So they can go there and there'll be links to my LinkedIn and they can contact me there.
Awesome. Well, it's easy to remember as well. So we like that. Yeah. And I'll put it in the episode description anyway, so everyone can find it. Well, that's it. Thank you again so much. It's been great talking to you today.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Well, what a great conversation. So many crucial lessons and insights there from Matt's experience in a very important, quite niche part, actually, of the tech sector. So thank you to Matt. If anything you've heard today has been interesting, if it's piqued your curiosity, if you will, and you want to learn more, please do click on the link in the episode description. It will take you to Matt's website, and there's a load more information about him and what he does there. Feel free to reach out as well. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. Huge thank you to Matt today for being so generous with his time and giving us so much of it. It was a fairly long episode in the end, but it was really interesting, and I thoroughly loved every minute of it. I hope all of you did as well, listeners. And listeners, speaking of you, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to us today. I hope you've enjoyed this techie episode today. As ever, I'm going to remind you again, your support is really what keeps this podcast going, especially when you hit that subscribe button, when you write those lovely reviews, as so many of you have now. It's all really appreciated, and it definitely helps me get out of bed in the morning to answer a question I often pose to guests. Do join us again for the next episode, tomorrow, not next week, tomorrow, because it is Christmas. And so my gift to you this year, once again, is daily episodes for Christmas week. So tomorrow we're going to have a conversation about transformation and change, which is something that is super relevant to the tech sector, especially in the last decade, as we've seen an ever increasing pace of change. And so to help me talk about that subject and really get to grips with it, I'll be joined by transformation expert Perry L. Bass. And he's got some amazing stories to share with us, some really keen insight into how to make a successful transformation, how to achieve change in your team, in your organization, without hitting too many of the inevitable road bumps, and a lot of leadership lessons as well from a long and distinguished career. So I hope you'll join me again tomorrow. I'll be here again, obviously. So yes, as I say, see you then. Well, I won't hear, you'll hear me. Yeah, that's the one. Until then, have a great morning, rest of your day, afternoon, evening, whenever it is you're listening to this. Have a great however long of your day you have left. I hope you're managing to start the wind down for the holiday season. Remember, be a leader, not a boss.